The war was over, but the true cost was just beginning to unfold. The Royal Navy's once dominant fleet of warships, symbols of British power, now sat idle in harbors, their towering guns gathering rust. With economic pressures mounting, the ships that had once ruled the seas were deemed obsolete, too costly to maintain in a world that was rapidly changing. What happened next was not a matter of choice but necessity. These mighty vessels were dismantled, reduced to scrap metal, and sold for parts. As the empire faded, so too did the ships that had once embodied its strength. The fate of these warships marked the end of an era for Britain. The war had ended. The sounds of battle, the smoke of combat, the roar of cannons, these were no more. But a new silence had descended upon the vast fleet of British warships, lying dormant in ports across the world. These ships, once symbols of the British Empire's might, had been rendered obsolete. The question now wasn't how to wage war, but what to do with the remnants of a war-fighting machine that no longer had a purpose. In 1945, as the horrors of the Second World War faded into the past, the world was left with a staggering amount of military hardware. The United Kingdom, in particular, faced the difficult task of deciding the fate of its vast fleet of warships. At the height of the war, the Royal Navy had boasted some of the largest and most powerful vessels in the world. But with the cessation of hostilities, these once proud ships found themselves vulnerable to a far different kind of threat: economic austerity. The financial strain of war had left Britain financially crippled. While the United States had emerged from the war stronger than ever, the United Kingdom was deeply in debt, struggling with reconstruction, and facing the loss of former colonies. The British government had little choice but to make cuts, and one of the first areas targeted was the military. The Royal Navy, once the envy of the seas, had to confront the grim reality of peacetime. As the priority shifted from military expenditure to post-war recovery, the fate of these warships began to take shape. The process of decommissioning the Royal Navy's fleet began almost immediately after the war's end. Many of the vessels, having been built for specific wartime roles, were considered too costly to maintain. Ships like the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Prince of Wales, which had once been the epitome of naval power, now sat idle in harbors, their towering guns and decks gathering rust. The decision was made that the majority of these ships would be scrapped, their steel sold for a fraction of the cost to build them. In the early days of post-war Britain, scrapping these warships was not a matter of choice but necessity. The cost of maintaining them, especially with the demand for resources to rebuild the country, was simply unsustainable. The harsh truth was that many of these ships were technologically outdated. The war had advanced naval design, and with new technological developments on the horizon, these vessels were soon seen as relics of a bygone era. It was cheaper to scrap them than to retrofit them for modern warfare. The scale of the task was staggering. By 1948, Britain had dismantled or sold off a significant portion of its wartime fleet. More than 100 ships were put up for sale, including carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Some were sold to foreign governments, but the majority were scrapped at one of the numerous shipbreaking yards that dotted the British coastline. Locations such as those in Belfast and Portsmouth became the final resting places for these once mighty vessels. The scrapping process itself was often brutal. The ships, which had been built with the finest materials, were methodically stripped of their valuable parts. The steel was cut into pieces, the machinery dismantled, and the weapons removed. The haunting sound of metal being cut and crushed reverberated across the yards as workers toiled in conditions that were harsh and dangerous. There was little room for sentimentality, only the need for efficiency. But even amidst the relentless pace of dismantling, some ships escaped the wrecking yard, if only temporarily. A few of the vessels were preserved as memorials or museum exhibits, but these were the exception rather than the rule. The remainder, often the most advanced ships, were reduced to scrap with little more than a final note in a bureaucratic ledger. The government's decision was not only practical but rooted in a larger geopolitical context. With the rise of the United States as the dominant naval power, Britain no longer needed to maintain a fleet that was on par with the one it had during the war. The global balance had shifted, and the Royal Navy's role had diminished dramatically. For those involved in the post-war decisions, the dismantling of these ships was a difficult but necessary task. The British Navy, once the protector of the Empire, had been forced into a period of self-reassessment. These ships, which had symbolized national pride and power, were now seen as burdens. The looming costs of retaining them, the economic pressures, and the shifting tides of global politics all contributed to the decision to discard them. The impact on the British people was complex. On one hand, many felt a sense of relief as the government turned its focus to rebuilding the nation, creating jobs, and providing for the citizens who had borne the heavy toll of the war. On the other hand, the disposal of these vessels symbolized the loss of Britain's former global dominance. The war had taken its toll on more than just the physical infrastructure. It had shifted the very perception of the nation's place in the world. Yet, while the dismantling and sale of these ships may have seemed like a practical, inevitable course of action, it also raised questions about the costs of historical loss. What happens when a nation is forced to discard the very instruments of its identity? What becomes of the memories and the pride that once swelled with the sound of their engines? These questions lingered, unanswered, as the once immense warships were reduced to piles of scrap metal. The fate of these vessels was not just about the ships themselves. It was about the British Navy, about the fall of an era, about the silent end of a chapter in history. And yet, even as the last of the ships were taken apart, something else began to emerge from the wreckage. Some of the steel, the machinery, and even the guns found new life in unexpected places. The process of scrapping these ships, though heart-wrenching for some, allowed resources to be repurposed to contribute to rebuilding the nation in ways that were not immediately apparent. The transition from wartime to peacetime was not a smooth one. It was messy, filled with uncertainty, and tinged with nostalgia for a past that could never return. The decision to dispose of the Royal Navy's fleet was a painful one, but it was also a reflection of the difficult choices that had to be made in the aftermath of such a devastating global conflict. As the years passed, the warships, once titans of the sea, faded into history. Yet, their story did not end with the scrapping process. There were those who would not forget them, who would remember the sacrifices they represented, and the men who had sailed upon them. The legacy of these ships, however, was not just about their battles or their victories. It was about what happened to them after the war, when the tides of history had turned and the demands of the present took precedence over the echoes of the past. The aftermath of the Royal Navy's post-war fleet disposal continued to unfold, revealing a complex mixture of economic, social, and geopolitical implications. As the last ships were dismantled and their parts sold off, the full scale of the consequences of this decision began to be more fully realized. For many, the end of the war meant not only the cessation of hostilities but the end of a way of life. The decline of British naval power was not merely the loss of ships, it was a symbolic end to an era of dominance, an undeniable indicator of a shifting global order. In the years following the dismantling of the fleet, the repercussions for Britain's identity and its place in the world were profound. The process of scrapping the ships was not done in isolation. It was part of a broader economic effort to address the challenges Britain faced in the post-war period. The financial pressure on the government was enormous, and the task of balancing reconstruction with the need for a military presence on the world stage was fraught with difficulty. The Navy was no longer the primary means of protecting British interests overseas. The military strategy had shifted, and the focus moved toward strengthening the country's position in the emerging Cold War. The decisions made in the immediate aftermath of the war would set the tone for Britain's future military policy. The shift away from large-scale naval power towards smaller, more specialized fleets began as early as the late 1940s, reflecting broader trends in international relations. The United States, now the world's foremost superpower, held the reins of global maritime security. For Britain, this meant that its naval strength was no longer the cornerstone of its defense strategy. The global imperial reach, which had once been maintained through the Navy, was no longer sustainable. The remnants of British power, embodied in these once mighty warships, now seemed irrelevant in the context of a new world order. The financial pressures that led to the disposal of these ships were multifaceted. A large portion of Britain's debt was owed to the United States, a situation that had worsened over the course of the war. The cost of maintaining the Navy in peacetime, particularly given the technological obsolescence of many of its ships, was seen as an unjustifiable expense. In the post-war period, a combination of austerity measures and the need for reconstruction meant that funding had to be redirected towards rebuilding the nation's infrastructure and economy. The government simply did not have the financial resources to maintain a vast fleet of aging warships. Furthermore, the technology of warfare had advanced so rapidly that many of the ships were simply no longer fit for modern combat. The guns that had once struck fear into enemies now seemed outdated in the face of new technologies such as nuclear weapons and jet aircraft. At the same time, there was the increasing realization that much of Britain's imperial reach, long supported by its naval power, was no longer viable. The end of the war also marked the beginning of the decolonization process, with many former colonies gaining independence in the years that followed. As the empire shrank, so too did the need for a large naval presence. The ships that had once been tasked with defending British interests across the world were now excess to requirements. It was not just the ships that were at the center of the decision-making process, but the broader strategic needs of a nation in transition. For the men who had sailed aboard these ships, the loss was a bitter one. Many had spent their entire careers aboard these vessels, and the thought of seeing them sold off or dismantled was difficult to bear. The HMS Hood, for example, had been the pride of the Royal Navy, and its loss in 1941 was a blow that reverberated throughout the service. The fate of the ships that followed the war was a reminder of the fragility of power, even for the most formidable empires. The decision to scrap the ships was not just a matter of practicality, however. There was a certain sadness that accompanied the loss of these vessels, which had symbolized an era of British naval dominance. To some, the dismantling of these ships represented the erosion of a national identity that had been built upon the Navy. These vessels had been the product of an empire that stretched across the globe, and their disposal was a stark reminder that such an empire was no longer sustainable. The same ships that had once carried British soldiers to distant shores were now being broken down for their metal, their engines stripped of their value. Yet even as these ships were being dismantled, a form of repurposing began to take place. The raw materials salvaged from the ships, the steel, the machinery, the engines, found new life in other industries. It was a form of economic pragmatism, recycling valuable resources in a time when the country's economy was in dire need of revitalization. Some of the metal was used in the construction of new buildings and infrastructure, while parts of the ships were repurposed for civilian use. The British people, many of whom had endured the hardships of war and rationing, were familiar with the value of reuse. The national effort to recover from the war was marked by a spirit of frugality, a determination to make the most of what was available. Still, the economic repurposing did little to alleviate the sense of loss that accompanied the removal of these ships from the national consciousness. For the workers involved in the scrapping process, the work was necessary but grim. The yards where these ships were taken apart were often cold, dirty, and dangerous. The men who worked there were aware of the significance of what they were doing. It was not just a ship they were dismantling, it was a piece of history, a link to a world that was no more. Over time, many of the ships that were dismantled became little more than distant memories. A few managed to survive in museums, their hulking forms preserved as relics of a bygone era. The HMS Belfast, now a floating museum in the Thames, is one of the few examples of a British warship that has retained its place in the national imagination. But the vast majority of these vessels were lost to history, their stories reduced to little more than archival photographs and faded memories. Even the ships that survived the scrapping process did not escape the slow erosion of time. The HMS Victory, the flagship of Admiral Lord Nelson during the Battle of Trafalgar, was one of the few ships to avoid being sent to the breakers' yards. Yet, the years have taken their toll on even this iconic vessel. The ongoing preservation efforts required to maintain the ship as a national treasure are constant, and the cost of preserving such a symbol of British naval history is high. The post-war years were a time of profound transition for Britain. The nation, still reeling from the aftermath of the war, had to confront not only the physical destruction of its cities but also the intangible losses that came with the decline of its imperial ambitions. The dismantling of the Royal Navy's warships, while necessary from an economic standpoint, symbolized the loss of something far greater, the fading of an empire, the passing of an era in which Britain had been a world power. In the decades that followed, the impact of these decisions would continue to be felt. The Navy, once the pride of Britain, became a smaller, less influential force. The Royal Navy was no longer the center of the British military establishment, and its ships were no longer the technological marvels they had once been. But for those who had served on the ships, the memories of those days remained vivid, and the knowledge that their ships had been dismantled rather than preserved was a bitter pill to swallow.